The alarms screamed through the corridors of the Erebus, a piercing wail that cut through the hum of the ship's engines. Commander Kael Voss stood at the helm, his voice steady but edged with urgency as he addressed the crew. "The Zorathians are coming," he said, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. "And they don't just want to conquer us, they want to erase us." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their faces illuminated by the flashing red lights of the alert system. Kael's gaze hardened as he leaned forward, his next words dropping like a hammer. "Our survival depends on one thing: our capacity for hate. It's the only weapon they can't predict." Outside the viewport, the dark void of space erupted with the sudden glow of incoming ships, their sleek, angular forms materializing like shadows given life. The Erebus shuddered as the first volley of plasma fire streaked past, narrowly missing the hull. Kael's voice rose above the chaos. "Brace for impact. This is it. We fight or we die." The crew scrambled to their stations, the weight of his words settling over them like a storm. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. As the Erebus shook under the relentless assault, the Zorathian fleet closed in, their ships forming a deadly ring around the human vessel. Plasma fire streaked across the void, lighting up the darkness with bursts of searing energy. Commander Kael Voss gripped the edge of the command console, his eyes locked on the enemy flagship looming large on the viewscreen. "Focus everything on their command ship." He barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms, and shouted orders. "Break their will, make them regret ever crossing us." The crew responded instantly, redirecting the ship's weapons toward the Zorathian leader. The Erebus's cannons roared to life, sending a volley of energy blasts hurtling toward the enemy. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Mira Reyes turned to Kael, her voice trembling but resolute. "Hate won't save us, Commander," she said, her words sharp with urgency. "It'll destroy us before it destroys them." Kael's jaw tightened as he met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "Then let it destroy them first," he replied, his tone cold and final. The weight of his words hung in the air, a grim reminder of the stakes they faced. The Erebus's weapons struck true, slamming into the Zorathian flagship with devastating force. The enemy ship shuddered, its hull buckling under the assault, but the victory came at a cost. The Erebus's engines sputtered, their once steady hum faltering as warning lights flashed across the control panels. "Engine failure," shouted one of the crew members, panic edging into their voice. "We're losing power." Kael's hands clenched into fists as he assessed the situation. The Zorathian fleet, though momentarily thrown into disarray, was regrouping. The Erebus was crippled, drifting helplessly in hostile space. "Get those engines back online," Kael ordered, his voice steady despite the dire circumstances. "We're not done yet," but as the crew scrambled to repair the damage, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded, surrounded by enemies who showed no mercy. The battle had taken its toll, and the Erebus was running out of time. Kael's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to turn the tide. The Zorathians had underestimated humanity's capacity for hate, but now, as the ship's systems failed and the enemy closed in, Kael wondered if that hate would be enough to save them, or if it would consume them all. The tension on the bridge was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. The crew worked feverishly, their movements sharp and precise, but the odds were stacked against them. The Zorathians were relentless, their ships closing in like predators circling wounded prey. Kael's gaze flicked to the viewscreen, where the enemy flagship still burned, a testament to their defiance. But defiance alone wouldn't be enough. They needed a miracle, or a plan. As the Erebus drifted further into the void, the crew braced themselves for what came next. The battle was far from over, and the cost of survival was rising with every passing moment. Kael's resolve hardened, his mind sharpening as he prepared to make the next move. The Zorathians had underestimated humanity once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. As the Erebus drifted further into the void, its systems barely holding together, the crew worked in tense silence. The battle had left them battered, but it was the quiet moments that felt the heaviest. It was during this lull that a faint signal caught the attention of the ship's communications officer. "Commander," the officer called out, breaking the silence. "We're picking up a transmission. It's Zorathian, but it's different, encrypted, but not like their usual codes." Kael's eyes narrowed. "Patch it through," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. The bridge fell silent as the transmission crackled to life, the voice of a Zorathian commander filling the air. The words were chilling, delivered with a cold, clinical precision. "Humanity's emotions are their weakness," the voice declared. "Their fear, their love, their hope. These are vulnerabilities we can exploit. But their hate is different. It is their greatest strength. It makes them unpredictable, dangerous, and so it must be eradicated." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Lieutenant Mira Reyes was the first to speak, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Is this what we've become?" she demanded, turning to Kael. "A species defined by hate. Is that all we are now?" Kael's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the now dark screen. "If it keeps us alive," he said, his voice cold and steady, "then yes." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Kael's statement settling over them like a shroud. Mira shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "This isn't who we are, Kael. Hate might keep us alive, but at what cost? What happens when the war is over? What happens to us then?" Kael turned to face her, his eyes hard. "If we don't survive, there won't be a then," he said. "We do what we must to live. That's all that matters." The tension on the bridge was palpable, the crew divided between Kael's ruthless pragmatism and Mira's desperate plea for humanity. The debate raged on, voices rising as the Zorathian fleet began to close in once more. "We're running out of time," one of the crew members shouted, their voice tinged with panic. "We need to make a decision now." Kael's mind raced, weighing their options. The Erebus was in no condition to fight another battle, and the Zorathians were closing in fast. "Prepare for an emergency jump," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're heading into uncharted space." The crew hesitated, the risks of such a move clear to everyone. "Uncharted space?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know what's out there. We could be jumping into something worse." Kael's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice," he said. "It's either that or wait here for the Zorathians to finish us off. I'm not ready to die today, are you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The crew moved quickly, preparing the ship for the jump as the Zorathian fleet drew closer. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. As the engines powered up, the ship shuddered, the strain of the damaged systems evident. "Jump coordinates set," the navigation officer announced, their voice tight with anxiety. Kael took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the control panel. "On my mark," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. 3, 2, 1, jump." The Erebus lurched violently as it entered the jump, the stars outside the viewscreen blurring into streaks of light. The crew held on tightly, the ship groaning under the strain. For a moment, it felt as though the ship might tear itself apart, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the jump was over. The Erebus emerged in an unfamiliar sector of space, the stars around them strange and unfamiliar. The crew exhaled collectively, the tension on the bridge easing slightly, but the relief was short-lived. As the ship's sensors came back online, the crew realized they were not alone. Strange readings appeared on the scanners, something massive and unknown lurking in the darkness. Kael's eyes narrowed as he studied the data. "What is that?" He muttered, his voice low. The revelation of the Zorathians' true motives had shaken them to their core, but now, as they drifted in uncharted space, the crew of the Erebus faced a new and uncertain threat. The battle for survival was far from over, and the cost of their choices was only beginning to reveal itself. As the Erebus drifted closer to the dying star, its faint, flickering light cast an eerie glow over the ship's battered hull. The crew worked in tense silence, their movements sharp and deliberate as they struggled to keep the ship's failing systems operational. Kael stood at the center of the chaos, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need parts," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "There's a derelict Zorathian station nearby. We'll scavenge what we can." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of their last encounter with the Zorathians still fresh in their minds. Mira stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with concern. "We don't know what's waiting for us over there," she said. "It could be a trap." Kael's expression didn't waver. "It's a risk we have to take," he replied. "Without those parts, we're dead in the void. Prepare a team, we move out in 10. The boarding party moved cautiously through the derelict station, their footsteps echoing in the cold, metallic corridors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls bore the scars of long-forgotten battles. As they ventured deeper, the crew began to uncover signs of something far more sinister than they had anticipated. Mira was the first to notice the containment cells, their doors pried open and the interiors stained with what could only be blood. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the remnants of experiments that sent a chill down her spine. "Kael," she called out, her voice trembling. "You need to see this." Kael joined her, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The walls were covered in Zorathian symbols, their meaning unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. Human prisoners had been held here, subjected to horrors that defied comprehension. Mira's hand brushed against a console, and a recording began to play, the voice of a Zorathian scientist filling the room. Without hate, the voice said, cold and clinical, "They are docile, controllable, their emotions make them weak, but their hate makes them dangerous. It must be eradicated." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mira turned to Kael, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're trying to strip us of what makes us human," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're trying to take away our will to fight." Kael's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening like steel. "They fear what we are," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They fear our hate because it's the one thing they can't control. If they want to take it from us, then we'll show them exactly what it means to face humanity at its worst." The crew worked quickly, gathering the parts they needed, but the weight of their discovery lingered. As they made their way back to the Erebus, the reality of their situation settled over them like a shadow. The Zorathians weren't just trying to conquer them, they were trying to erase them, to strip away the very essence of what made them human. Back on the ship, Kael addressed the crew, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, "but not much. The Zorathians are closing in, and they won't stop until we're either dead or broken, but we're not going to let that happen. We're going to fight, and we're going to win not just for ourselves, but for everyone they've tried to destroy." The crew nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They had faced the darkness and survived, but the cost of their survival was becoming clearer with every passing moment. As the Erebus powered up its engines and prepared to move on, the crew couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, and that the true battle was only just beginning. As the Erebus drifted further into the gravitational pull of the dying star, the tension aboard the ship was palpable. The faint, flickering light of the star cast long shadows across the command deck, where Kael stood, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Zorathian fleet was closing in, their ships forming a deadly crescent as they prepared to strike. Kael's voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "They've found us," he said, his tone steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But this time, we're not running, we're going to use this star to end them." Mira stepped forward, her face etched with concern. "Kael, this plan is insane," she said, her voice rising. "We're talking about using a star's gravity well as a weapon. One wrong move, and we'll be pulled in with them. This isn't a victory, it's suicide." Kael turned to her, his expression unyielding. "It's survival," he replied, his voice low but firm. "They've hunted us, tortured us, tried to strip us of everything that makes us human. If we don't fight back now, we'll never get another chance. This is our moment to turn their hate against them." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Kael's words sinking in. They had faced the Zorathians before, but this was different. This was a gamble with no guarantees, a desperate bid to strike back against an enemy that had pushed them to the brink. Yet as Kael's resolve hardened, so did theirs. One by one, they nodded, their faces set with determination. Kael turned back to the tactical display, his fingers flying across the controls. "Prepare the ship for maximum thrust," he ordered. "We'll need to skirt the edge of the gravity well, close enough to lure them in but not so close that we can't pull away. And ready the EMP pulse when they are in position. We'll disable their engines and let the star do the rest." The crew sprang into action, their movements precise and urgent. The Erebus shuddered as its engines roared to life, the ship angling toward the star's glowing corona. Behind them, the Zorathian fleet followed, their ships closing the distance with terrifying speed. As the Erebus neared the edge of the gravity well, Kael's voice rang out across the command deck. "Now," he shouted, the ship's EMP pulse surged outward, a wave of energy that rippled through the void. The Zorathian ships faltered, their engines sputtering as the pulse disrupted their systems. For a moment, the fleet hung in space, vulnerable and exposed. Then, the star's gravity took hold. One by one, the Zorathian ships were pulled into the star's fiery embrace, their hulls buckling under the immense pressure. The Erebus strained against the pull, its engines screaming as the crew fought to keep the ship from following the enemy into oblivion. Mira gripped the console, her knuckles white as she monitored the ship's systems. "We're losing power on the port side," she shouted. "If we don't pull away now, we're not going to make it." Kael's hands moved swiftly, adjusting the ship's trajectory. "Hold it together," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We're almost clear." The Erebus shuddered violently as it broke free from the star's gravitational pull, its hull scorched and battered but intact. Behind them, the last of the Zorathian ships disappeared into the star's fiery depths, their screams silenced by the void. For a moment, the command deck was silent, the crew too stunned to speak. They had done it. They had turned the tide against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. But the victory was bittersweet, the cost of their survival etched into the scars that now marred the Erebus and the faces of its crew. Kael leaned heavily against the console, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We made it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over." "Not yet." Mira looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "What happens now?" she asked. Kael straightened, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "Now," he said, We go home, and we make sure they never forget what we're capable of. The Erebus turned toward the distant glow of human space, its engines humming softly as it carried its weary crew away from the dying star. The battle was won, but the war was far from over, and the scars they carried, both seen and unseen, would shape the battles yet to come. As the Erebus drifted closer to the familiar glow of Earth, the weight of their journey settled heavily on the crew. The ship, battered and scarred, was a testament to the battles they had fought and the sacrifices they had made. Inside, the atmosphere was somber, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the engines. Kael stood at the center of the command deck, his presence commanding yet weary. The crew gathered around him, their faces reflecting the toll of their ordeal. Kael's voice broke the silence, steady but heavy with emotion. "We won," he began, his words echoing through the deck. "Not because we were stronger or smarter, but because we refused to be broken. Our hate, our anger, it was our shield, our weapon, our salvation. It's what kept us alive when everything else failed." Mira stepped forward, her eyes searching Kael's face. "But at what cost, Kael?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "If we become what they fear, if we let hate define us, are we still human? Or have we lost something just as important as our lives?" Kael paused, his gaze drifting to the stars outside the viewport. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with her question, the weight of it pressing down on him. Then he turned back to her, his expression resolute but tinged with sorrow. "As long as we survive," he said quietly, "we'll find out." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the choices they had made and the price they had paid. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, each grappling with the implications of Kael's words. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The scars they carried both on the ship and within themselves were a constant reminder of the battles they had fought and the enemy they had become. As the Erebus entered Earth's orbit, the crew gathered at the viewport, their eyes fixed on the blue and green planet below. It was a sight they had longed for, a symbol of home and safety. Yet, as they looked down at the world they had fought so hard to protect, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were returning as different people. The war had changed them, shaping them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Kael stood apart from the others, his arms crossed as he stared at the planet below. His mind raced with thoughts of the future of the battles yet to come and the legacy they would leave behind. He had led them to victory, but the cost had been high. The question Mira had asked lingered in his mind, a shadow he couldn't shake. Mira joined him at the viewport, her presence a quiet comfort. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with determination. Kael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Now we rebuild, we prepare, and we make sure they never forget what we're capable of." The Erebus descended toward Earth, its engines humming softly as it carried its weary crew home. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished, and as they stepped onto the soil of their homeworld, they knew that the choices they had made and the hate that had driven them would shape the battles yet to come. The story ends with the Erebus drifting toward Earth, its crew forever changed by the weight of their choices and the legacy of their hate. They had survived, but the cost of that survival would echo through the stars, a reminder of the darkness they had embraced and the humanity they had fought to protect. If you found this journey through the stars compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping sci-fi tales. Until next time, keep exploring the cosmos and the depths of what it means to be human.